the night Bianca Castile decided to humiliate a waitress. She had no idea she was spitting on the only person alive who could burn her entire world to the ground. It happened on the 60th floor of the Aviary, Chicago's most exclusive restaurant, in a private dining room where every man along the wall carried a gun under his tailored jacket and answered to one name only. Bianca, 29, draped in $40,000 of silk and diamonds, was celebrating her engagement to the most feared man in the city, and she wanted everyone in that glittering room to watch her do it. When a single drop of wine touched the linen, she rose from her chair, pointed one manicured finger at the server's face, and asked loud enough for the whole table to hear whether the girl could even read, or whether her kind from the South Side had never seen the inside of a school. The woman she was screaming at was 27 years old, her dark hair pulled back with the same cheap elastic band she'd worn all week, her hands raw from double shifts, her name tag reading simply Maggie. She didn't cry, she didn't flinch. She counted to 3 inside her head, the way she'd taught herself to do 8 years ago, and she said absolutely nothing, because the silence of a woman who's already lost everything is a far more dangerous thing than any scream. What nobody in that room understood was that the trembling little waitress balancing their $300 plates had once been the sharpest financial mind a criminal empire had ever owned, the woman who'd memorized every dirty dollar that moved through this family's restaurants, docks, and warehouses, the keeper of a ledger so secret that powerful men had torn her family apart to bury it. 8 years ago, that woman had vanished off the face of the earth, and she hadn't disappeared empty-handed. When Bianca's heel came down on a small silver coin that had slipped from Maggie's apron, an old, worn coin stamped with the image of a falcon, she laughed and called it junk, never realizing she'd just ground her shoe into the one symbol that could make every armed man in that room drop to one knee. And then something happened that froze the entire room solid. Tobias Vane, 37 years old, the boss who hadn't spoken a soft word to anyone in nearly a decade, the man whose stillness made hardened enforcers sweat through their shirts, set down his glass, crossed the floor in complete silence, and bent down to pick that coin up off the marble himself. He turned it over once in his scarred fingers. He looked at the falcon, and then he looked at the waitress, really looked at her, the way a man looks at a ghost he's been hunting for 8 long years and never thought he'd find pouring his wine. Nobody breathed. Bianca's smug little smile died on her lips, because in that frozen second, every single person at that table realized that the powerful man at the head of it cared more about a dirty silver coin and a nobody from the South Side than he did about the woman he was supposed to marry, and not one of them, not even Tobias himself, yet understood why. Before we go any further, if a story about a quiet woman the whole world underestimated is exactly the kind of story you love, do me a small favor and tap that like button right now. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so the next chapter finds its way straight to you. And share this with one person who needs to be reminded that the strongest people in the room are almost always the quietest. Now, let's go back to that frozen dining room, 60 floors above the city, and find out exactly who Maggie Holt really is. In the silence that stretched so long it seemed possible to hear the candles burning, Tobias Vane did not say a single word. He only walked slowly toward the place where Maggie was standing, his gray eyes as cold as a frozen lake still fixed on her face, then placed the silver coin back into her palm, with a care so strange it was almost ceremonial, in the way one returns something that had belonged to its owner for a very long time. His scarred fingers touched the reddened hollow of her palm for only one brief instant, but Maggie felt the weight of that touch travel down her spine like a current of electricity, and she forced herself to keep her breathing steady, forced her face to remain utterly blank. Even though her heart was pounding so hard, she was afraid the whole room could hear it. He did not ask where she had gotten the coin. He did not ask her name. He only closed her hand around the coin, held her fist in his for another half-second, then turned his back and walked toward the chair at the head of his table, without bothering to glance even once at the woman he was about to marry. His silence was more frightening than any command, because every man standing along the wall understood that when Tobias Vane chose to say nothing, that was when he was most dangerous. Bianca stood frozen beside her chair, her perfectly made-up face slowly changing from triumph to confusion, and finally into a pale rage. She had just publicly humiliated a nameless server to assert her power before the entire family, And yet the most powerful man in the room, the man who should have stood on her side, had treated that girl as if she were something precious while Bianca herself was entirely invisible. She opened her mouth to say something, some sharp line of mockery to reclaim the stage, but Tobias let his gaze pass over her just once, cold and flat as a blade, and the words died in her throat. Maggie lowered her head very deeply, her voice steady and soft enough to be almost inaudible, asking to be excused so she could bring more wine for the guests, and without waiting for anyone's permission, she quietly backed out of the room, with the empty tray in her hands, each step firm, even though her legs were trembling beneath her apron. She did not allow herself to look back. She knew perfectly well that looking back now would mean admitting something, and admitting something would mean death, not only for her, but for the little sister waiting for surgery in a place very far away. The moment the heavy wooden door closed behind her, separating her from that room full of guns and diamonds, a firm hand seized her elbow and pulled her hard into the dim service hallway. It was Della Brandt, the 63-year-old manager of the aviary, a woman with neatly cropped silver hair and eyes that had seen through every filthy trick of the upper class over 35 years of serving them. She pushed Maggie into the shadowed corner behind the wine cabinets, lowered her voice into a hurried whisper, and asked whether Maggie knew what she had just done, asked what in God's name she had dropped to the floor that could make Tobias Vane himself leave his chair, something Della had never seen him do for anyone in all the years that family had set foot inside this restaurant. Maggie tightened her hand around the coin until its sharp edge cut into her flesh, and she only shook her head, saying it was just an old family keepsake, nothing important. But Della looked at her with the eyes of someone who knew exactly when she was being lied to, her gaze narrowing with suspicion, because she had been standing close enough to see what was stamped on the face of that coin, the image of a falcon with its wings spread, the same mark she had glimpsed only once many years ago, engraved on the ring of a man this entire city feared. She opened her mouth to ask more, but Maggie lifted her eyes, and in that moment, the woman who had seemed so calm she was almost lifeless a moment earlier, suddenly revealed something cold and fathomless deep in her gaze, something that made Della instinctively step back half a pace. Maggie pushed the coin deep into the pocket of her apron, smoothed the fabric flat, and said quietly that the less Della knew about it, the safer she would be. Then she picked up a fresh bottle of wine and stepped back into the light, leaving Della standing alone in the darkness, with a question rising in her mind that she did not dare speak aloud. How a poor server from the South Side could possibly be carrying the most sacred symbol of power in an entire underworld empire. Maggie's shift ended at 1 o'clock in the morning, and as on every other night, she was the last person to leave the glass tower, quietly descending in the employee elevator, crossing the alley behind the restaurant, where the smell of garbage and grease from the industrial kitchen tangled with the skin-cutting cold of Chicago in November. She pulled the collar of her frayed winter coat higher, shoved both hands into her pockets, one pocket feeling the familiar weight of the silver coin that tonight had somehow become heavier than ever, then walked 8 blocks to the subway station through the bitter wind that howled between the high-rises. The last train back to the South Side was nearly empty, with only a few exhausted figures slumped over in their seats, and Maggie sat down beside the fogged glass window, letting her own pale face reflect back at her from the dark pane, a 27-year-old woman with eyes hollowed by lack of sleep, and hair still tied with a cheap elastic that had lost all its stretch. She took out her phone, its screen cracked in one long diagonal line, and reread the message from the aunt, who was caring for her younger sister, a short line saying Pippa had another spell of shortness of breath that afternoon, but was stable now, and that the hospital had called again to remind them about the missing deposit for the surgery. Maggie closed her eyes, pressed her forehead against the freezing window, and let that number roll over and over in her mind like a heavy stone. $80,000, the price of repairing the failing heart of her 16-year-old sister, the only sister she had left in the world, and after 2 years of working 2 shifts a day and sending away nearly every dollar she earned, Maggie had saved less than 1/5 of it. Pippa had been born with a heart defect, a frail heart from birth that the doctors said would only grow more dangerous the longer they waited. And every time Maggie made a video call home and saw the girl's pale face still trying to smile, saw the way she hid her exhaustion, so her older sister would worry less. Maggie's own heart felt squeezed by a helplessness no words could ever fully describe. The train stopped at her station, and Maggie dragged herself through the final 4 blocks to the old apartment building, climbed the stairs to the 5th floor because the elevator had been broken since summer, and opened the door to the cramped apartment of only 18 square meters, a single room with a kitchen built into the wall, a mattress laid on the floor, and a shared bathroom at the end of the hallway that she had to divide with 4 other apartments. Rent was $420 a month, and even that number forced her to calculate every penny, cut back on meals, and wear the same old clothes through one winter after another. She sank onto the edge of the mattress without bothering to take off her coat, pulled the silver coin from her pocket, placed it on her palm beneath the weak yellow glow of the room's only light bulb, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to tremble. The falcon with its wings spread on the face of the coin stared back at her, like a silent reminder of everything she had lost, and she clenched it in her fist, whispering to herself that she had kept this secret for 8 years, had buried the person she used to be so deep. She had almost believed that person was truly dead, and yet in one careless moment when the coin fell to the floor, Tobias Vane's eyes had dragged her straight back into the world she had fled with her whole life. She knew exactly what it meant, knew that from the moment he saw the falcon, she was no longer safe, and that fear was not for herself alone, but for Pippa too, because if they found Maggie, they would find the girl, and a sister with a heart condition would become the deadliest weakness she possessed. Maggie lay down on the thin mattress, pulled the old blanket up to her chin, and stared wide-eyed at the spreading water stain on the ceiling, and in the cold darkness of that small room, she made herself the same promise she had made 1,000 times before, that she would survive, that she would earn enough money to save her sister, and that she would never let the world that had killed her family touch what remained of it, though she did not yet know that the world had already begun following her trail from the very moment the coin struck the marble floor. In that broken, unfinished sleep, as on every night for the past 8 years, memory came back for Maggie, and this time it carried her back to the person she used to be, before she became a nameless server on the South Side. Before she learned to count to 3 and swallow every feeling down into the deepest part of herself. Her real name wasn't Maggie, it was Magdalene Holt, daughter of Elias Holt, and she had once been the financial mind of the Falcone family, the underworld empire that ruled an intricate network of restaurants, docks, and warehouses stretching across Chicago. Her father had held that role before her. A quiet man with gentle eyes and a mind frighteningly sharp, the man who had taught her to read a balance sheet when she was 12 years old, the man who had taught her that numbers never knew how to lie, even when people did, and that memory was the only weapon no one could ever seize from her hands. She had inherited that extraordinary memory from him, the ability to see a string of numbers once and carve it permanently into her mind. And it was that very ability that had made her the most valuable thing the family possessed, the only person who carried in her head the entire map of the money flow, every dirty dollar washed clean through tangled accounts, every road by which money entered and left the empire. People called her the shadow bookkeeper because she never wrote anything down unless she had to. Everything stayed neatly inside her mind, safer than any vault. Boss Salvio Falcone, the head of the family then, an old man with silver hair and a voice deep as rolling thunder, had trusted her and her father absolutely, and to prove it, he had given Elias a silver coin engraved with the image of a falcon, the sacred symbol reserved only for those in whom the family placed its deepest trust, the same coin now lying in the pocket of her apron. But then, 8 years earlier, everything collapsed in a single night. Maggie still remembered that night with cruel clarity. Remembered the telephone ringing close to midnight, remembered the cold voice telling her there had been a fire at the warehouse by the docks, that her father had been inside when the flames broke out, that there was nothing left to save. They told her Elias Holt was dead, that he had betrayed the family, embezzled a vast sum of money, then tried to run, and that his death was the price he had paid. They told her many things in the chaos of that night, but there was one thing no one could give her, one thing that had haunted her through her most wakeful hours for the past 8 years, and that was her father's body. No funeral, no coffin, nothing but a heap of ashes, they told her, was all that remained. and a warning that if she didn't want to share the same fate, she needed to disappear at once and never come back. She was only 19 years old then, alone and terrified, and she had believed them because she had no other choice, because fear had swallowed every doubt inside her. She had burned every document bearing her real name, cut off every connection, taken her little sister, who was only 8 years old at the time, along with her father's falcon coin, and fled into the city's darkness, changing her name, changing the person she was, learning how to become invisible. She buried Magdalene Holt so deep that she had almost convinced herself the brilliant girl once respected by an entire empire had truly died with her father in that fire. But sometimes, on nights like this one, a thought still slipped into her mind like a thin thread that had never fully broken. A question she never dared allow herself to ask aloud. Why a careful man who loved his children would suddenly betray everything? And why, after all those years, she had never been allowed to see him, not even once, not even as a handful of charred bones on which she could place a flower. She always pushed that thought away, burying it with everything else, because hope was a luxury someone like her wasn't allowed to have. But tonight, with the falcon coin clenched tightly in her hand, and Tobias Vane's gaze still clinging to her mind, that thin thread suddenly trembled, and for the first time in 8 long years, Maggie couldn't extinguish it. That same night, in a place that felt almost a world away from the South Side, Tobias Vane stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling glass window of the penthouse on the top floor of a tower overlooking the Chicago River. A glass of whiskey he had not once brought to his lips held loosely in his hand, his cold gray eyes fixed on the sea of glittering lights below, without truly seeing anything at all. The penthouse was vast and empty enough that the sound of his own footsteps echoed back from the marble walls, a space furnished with the most expensive things money could buy, yet as cold and soulless as a museum after closing time. And he had lived here for the past 8 years, without ever once feeling that it was a home. Tobias Vane was the most feared man in Chicago, the one who had climbed to the top of the Falcone Empire with an iron hand and a heart people whispered had frozen long ago. The one who gave orders without mercy and punished without hesitation. The one even the most seasoned men under him lowered their heads before, careful to avoid his eyes. He had learned very early that trust was a luxury that would kill whoever dared possess it, that every smile hid a knife, and that the only way to survive in this world was to make everyone afraid enough that no one dared betray him. He had lived by that rule for 8 years, ever since the night boss Salvio Falcone, the man who had picked him up from the streets when he was still a homeless boy, the man who had raised him like his own son and handed him an empire, suddenly died. And tonight, for the first time in many years, something had cracked the solid layer of ice he had so carefully built around himself, and that something was only an old, worn silver coin in the hand of a server. He couldn't drive away the image of the falcon, with its wings spread engraved on the face of that coin, because he knew too well what it was, knew that throughout the family's history, that sacred symbol had been given only to a rare few people in whom Boss Salvio placed absolute trust, and knew that one of those rare coins had once belonged to a name he had not allowed himself to speak for the past 8 years, the Holt family, the accountants cursed by the entire family as traitors, the ones who had embezzled, fled, and vanished without a trace. Then why, he asked himself, his brows drawn tight in the darkness, why was the falcon coin of a dead traitor family lying in the apron pocket of a poor server from the South Side? And why did that girl's face, the way she counted time in silence, the way she looked at him without trembling like everyone else, make something deep and long asleep in his chest begin to stir? He turned the imagined coin over in his memory, and with it, another question, a far more dangerous question he had never dared face, began rising from the depths of his mind like air bubbles from a sunken wreck. For 8 years, as he sat on the family throne, he had always been told that the power belonged to him by rightful claim, that Boss Salvio had chosen him, that everything had happened exactly as it was meant to happen. But why had the death of the adoptive father he had loved and respected come so suddenly, so conveniently, right after the Holt family disappeared? And why had no one, in all those years, ever allowed him to question the order of the events from that night? He had never let himself follow that line of thought any further, because digging into it meant shaking the very foundation beneath his feet, meant admitting that perhaps he did not understand his world as well as he had always believed. But tonight, The calm face of the server and the falcon in her hand had awakened a vague unease he could not name, a feeling that some important piece in the story of his life had been deliberately hidden from him, and that the quiet girl, somehow, was holding that very piece. He set the whiskey glass down on the windowsill without drinking a drop, and for the first time in 8 years, Tobias Vane stayed awake all night, not because he was planning a purge, but because of a question he did not dare ask. 2 days later, on a quiet Thursday evening with few guests, Tobias Vane returned to the aviary, and this time he came alone. No dazzling Bianca at his side, no armed men standing along the walls, not even a driver waiting downstairs in the lobby. Only one man in a simple black coat walking into the restaurant like an ordinary guest. And that very simplicity made the entire staff more tense than any entourage could have. Because when a wolf comes without needing its pack, that is when it is most dangerous. He asked to be seated in the section Maggie was serving, and Della, standing behind the host, with her face gone rigid, understood at once that this was no coincidence. Maggie recognized him the instant she stepped out of the kitchen, with a tray of wine in her hands, and although her heart tightened, she did not reveal even the slightest hesitation. She walked to his table with exactly the calm, professional bearing she gave every guest, set down the menu, and asked what he would like in a steady voice that did not tremble at all. Tobias did not look at the menu. He leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes locked on her, and said he had heard the restaurant had a very rare red wine from Tuscany, the kind the Falcone family often ordered privately for important occasions. Then he let the name fall into the air, and watched her reaction like a hunter watching the surface of water for a ripple. Maggie did not blink. She nodded, said she knew the bottle he was referring to, and calmly replied that it was a refined choice, because that wine needed to be opened at least 1 hour in advance to breathe before it could reach its fullest flavor, a detail only someone with real knowledge would know. Tobias tilted his head slightly, then continued probing, mentioning another restaurant by the docks that he said had once belonged to the family years ago, asking whether she happened to know the place, his voice gentle, though every word was a carefully laid trap. Maggie knew exactly what he was doing. Her father had taught her how to recognize an interrogation disguised as a conversation, and she understood that every answer she gave was being weighed on an invisible scale. She replied that she was only a server and knew nothing about old restaurants by the docks, her voice perfect in its innocence. But in the very moment she bent down to pour water for him, one small mistake slipped beyond her control. Because when he released another name, the name of an old shipping route that only people inside the world would know, her hands froze for exactly a fraction of a second before she continued pouring, a pause so brief that 99% of people in the world would never have noticed. But Tobias Vane was not 99% of people. He saw that hesitation, saw it as clearly as a crack across ice, and one corner of his mouth lifted faintly, not into a smile, but into the confirmation of a hunter who had just found his prey's tracks. Maggie knew she had just exposed something, and she immediately set the water pitcher down, stepped back half a pace, and said with perfect politeness that she would go get the wine right away, then turned away with every step perfectly controlled, not fast, not slow, not letting him see that beneath her apron her knees were trembling. The moment she disappeared into the service hallway, Della was already waiting there, and she seized Maggie's arm, pulling her into a hidden corner with a bloodless face. She whispered urgently that the man out there had not come here to eat dinner, that she had worked in this business for 35 years and knew the eyes of someone hunting for something, and that the way he looked at Maggie was not the way a guest looks at a server, but the way an animal studies its prey before striking. She gripped Maggie's shoulders tightly, looked straight into her eyes, and said in a rare, grave voice that men who silently watch you that always have a dangerous hidden motive, that she had to be extremely careful, and that if she was truly hiding something, then it was time for her to think about leaving this city. Maggie looked at the older woman who had quietly protected her for the past 2 years, and for the first time she felt guilt rising inside her chest, because she knew that Della merely standing too close to her now was already enough to put the woman in danger. She only nodded faintly, picked up the bottle of red wine, and stepped back into the light, where Tobias Vane was waiting with gray eyes that had not left her for even a second. Bianca Castile was not the kind of woman who easily forgot a humiliation, and the moment Tobias ignored her in front of the entire family had lodged itself in her pride like a shard of glass that could not be pulled free. Over the days that followed, she could not stop thinking about that nameless server girl, about the way the most powerful man in the city had bent down to pick up the coin for her, and each time the memory returned, a surge of jealousy mixed with shame rose inside her until she clenched her teeth. She decided that the girl had to disappear, not in the bloody way her world was used to, but in a more refined way, a way that would crush her quietly until there was no trace left. She called the senior management of the corporation that owned the aviary directly, using the vain name like a weapon, demanding that the server named Maggie be fired at once for disrespectful behavior toward an honored guest. But what she had not expected was that Della Brandt stepped in front of it. The old manager flatly refused, stating that her employee would never be dismissed because of a guest's impulsive whim, and that, if necessary, the security cameras would clearly prove who had truly behaved without restraint that night. Bianca hung up in a fury, and when she could not get the girl fired through official channels, she turned to another method. She hired people to follow Maggie. From that day on, whenever Maggie finished her shift and stepped out into the alley behind the restaurant, she began to feel an invisible gaze clinging to her back, a car parked at the corner longer than it should have been, a figure standing too long across from the train station. She did not turn her head, she did not change her route or quicken her pace. 8 years of living in fear had taught her that the best way to unsettle predators was to show them no sign of prey, and she walked home with the same calm rhythm as every other night, even as inside, she was memorizing every detail, every license plate, every face, storing all of it in her extraordinary memory to use when the time came. That perfect silence and composure of hers somehow drove Bianca even more insane when the men following her reported back, because Bianca had expected the girl to panic, to run, to beg, yet there she was, still moving as if nothing had happened, and that very composure made Bianca feel challenged, dismissed, looked down upon, a feeling she could not endure. In her irritation, Bianca went to the only person she trusted enough to confide in, her uncle, Aldrich Mercer, a 54-year-old man who had served as a trusted advisor to the Falcone family for decades, the right-hand man even Tobias Vane himself trusted. Aldrich was a composed man with carefully groomed salt and pepper hair, and a smile that always appeared at precisely the right moment, a man who spoke so softly and politely that it was easy to forget true power inside an underworld empire did not belong to the one holding the gun, but to the one whispering into the ear of the man holding it. When Bianca told him about the server girl, about the coin, about the way Tobias had reacted, she noticed something pass across her uncle's face, a brief freezing in his eyes when she mentioned the falcon engraved on the coin, so quick she almost missed it. Aldrich set his teacup down slowly, and in his usual smooth voice, advised his niece to stay calm, to let him handle this matter, and not to involve herself further with that girl. But there was something in the way he said it that made Bianca, for the first time in her life, feel a vague chill run along her spine, because she suddenly became aware that the uncle she had always seen as her support was hiding something from her, that he cared about that coin far more than he was letting on. She pushed the feeling away, telling herself she was imagining things, because all her life, Aldrich had been the one who arranged everything for her, including the marriage to Tobias, that she had once believed was the summit of her destiny. But when she left her uncle's study that evening, that uneasy feeling still refused to fade, lingering at the edge of her mind like a shadow, and although she could not yet give it a name, Bianca wondered for the first time whether she truly understood the man she trusted most. On a gray Saturday afternoon, just as Maggie finished her lunch shift and stepped into the alley behind the restaurant, she saw him waiting. Tobias Vane was leaning against the hood of a gleaming black car parked about half a block from the service door, not talking on the phone, not pretending to look elsewhere, simply standing there with both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat and his gray eyes aimed straight at the door she had just stepped through, as if he knew down to the exact minute when her shift would end. Maggie did not slow her steps, nor did she change direction. She walked straight toward him with the calm bearing of someone for whom running into the most powerful man in the city in an empty alley was the most ordinary thing in the world. When she came close, he pulled his phone from his pocket, lit the screen, and silently held it out in front of her. It was a series of photographs, clear and sharp, capturing the men who had been following her over the past few days, the cars parked at street corners, the shadows standing across from the train station, and along with them were several messages he had intercepted. Cold instructions demanding that they find every weakness of the server named Maggie, so her life could be crushed. Tobias said in a low, flat voice that Bianca had given the order, that she was doing everything she could to ruin Maggie, and that he thought Maggie should know it so she could protect herself. Maggie glanced over the phone screen, but did not reach out to take it. She only lifted her eyes to his and asked why he was showing her these things. Tobias answered that he did not like the way his fiancée entertained herself, and that he did not want to see an innocent person destroyed because someone else's pride had been wounded. But Maggie understood that it was not the whole truth. She knew a man like him never did anything without a purpose, and that all of this was only another move in the game he was playing with her, another way to make her open up, to make her reveal the real person beneath the apron. She stood still in the cold wind, letting an old newspaper blow and tumble across the pavement between them, and instead of thanking him or showing fear as he might have expected, she suddenly asked him an unrelated question, a question that made him go still. She asked how long he had been in control of the family. Tobias blinked, clearly caught off guard by a question coming from a direction he had not anticipated, and after a moment of silence, he answered that it had been 8 years. Maggie nodded very slowly. The nod of someone whose theory had just been confirmed. A nod that darkened her eyes with something he could not read. Then she said softly that she understood, and turned away without another word. Tobias stood frozen beside his car, watching the small figure in the old frayed coat move farther toward the train station, and something he had never felt before rose inside his chest. Not anger at being walked away from by a server in the middle of a conversation, but a confusion so deep it reached his bones, because that girl had not been afraid of him. In all 8 years sitting at the top of the empire, he had grown used to people lowering their heads when he entered a room, used to even his most seasoned men breaking into sweat beneath his stare, used to an entire city trembling whenever the name Vane was spoken, so much so that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand before someone who did not tremble. Yet this girl, this small woman, with reddened hands and hair tied back with a cheap elastic, a woman the whole world could crush with a careless flick of its hand, had looked straight into his eyes without blinking, then walked away as if he was the one who had just been questioned. And there was that question too, that question about 8 years. It kept echoing through his mind, because he could feel that behind it was something she knew and he did not, a piece she had just quietly placed into its proper position, inside a picture he had not even known existed. He watched her vanish completely around the corner, without looking back once. And for the first time in his life, Tobias Vane felt that he was the one being left behind. The question about 8 years, the question Maggie had thrown at Tobias before walking away, was in truth the same question gnawing at her from the inside, because the perfect overlap between the moment he took power and the moment her family was erased could not possibly be mere coincidence. That night, after many days of hesitation, Maggie decided to do something she had avoided for 8 years. She went to find the only living person who could help her piece the picture back together, a woman named Priya Wexford. Priya had once been a forensic accountant and legal advisor for the family many years earlier, a sharp 44-year-old woman who had withdrawn from the underworld and lived in hiding inside a cramped apartment in Pilsen, surrounded by towering stacks of files and law books. She had worked with Maggie's father, and she was one of the few people who knew Elias Holt was not the traitor everyone believed him to be. And when she opened the door and saw Maggie standing on the threshold after all those years, her face went briefly pale, as if she had just seen a ghost. The two women sat across from each other, beneath the weak yellow glow of a desk lamp, and Maggie began telling everything for the first time. Not through emotion, but through numbers, through the extraordinary memory she had kept intact inside her mind for 8 years. She recited every money trail, every account, every path the money had taken, in the final months before her father was said to have died, and Priya listened with absolute focus, occasionally scribbling a few numbers onto a sheet of paper. The more she listened, the harder Priya's face became, because the figures Maggie recited did not match the official story the family had spread. When Maggie stopped, Priya set down her pen and said in a low voice that she had always suspected something was wrong, but now the numbers had confirmed it. She explained that the money Elias had been accused of embezzling had not actually disappeared from the empire at all, but had been moved around through a series of intermediary accounts before returning, cleaned and renamed, finally flowing into places that only one person with enough power and cunning could have arranged. And the name that appeared at the end of all those roads, the only person with access to every account, the ability to falsify the books with such precision, and the motive to frame the Holt family, was Aldrich Mercer. Maggie sat in stunned silence as she heard that name, connecting it to the flash of stillness she herself had sensed, connecting it to the way that trusted advisor always stood just behind power without ever sitting on the throne. But then Priya said one more thing that made Maggie's entire world tilt. She pointed to one link in the money trail Maggie had just recited, a very small recurring payment, cleverly disguised, still quietly flowing out at regular intervals for the past 8 years to an address Priya could not trace. And she said a money stream like that never existed to support a dead man. She explained that Maggie's father was the only person who had held the original ledger, the ledger with the real signatures and seals that could prove Aldrich's guilt before the entire family, and that a man as cunning as Aldrich would never destroy a piece that valuable. He would keep it so he could use it for control. Maggie carried the entire map of the money flow in her head, but memory alone was not enough to accuse anyone before a family council. She needed physical evidence. She needed the original ledger, and that original ledger was with the person who had kept it. Priya looked straight into Maggie's eyes, and in a voice so soft it was almost afraid of the words it was about to speak. She said the thing Maggie had never dared hope for in 8 years, that her father, very possibly, was still alive. While Maggie sat in Priya's cramped apartment listening to the one thing she had never dared hope for. On the other side of the city, Tobias Vane was following a thread of his own, a thread that the girl's question about 8 years had accidentally pulled loose from the tangle of memories he had buried long ago. He sat alone in his dim study with only one desk lamp turned on, spread before him the old files he had ordered his men to pull from the family's private archives. Documents about the night boss Salvio Falcone died and the night the Holt family disappeared. 2 events he had spent 8 years treating as separate matters, though now he was beginning to suspect they were part of the same story. He turned each page slowly, his gray eyes moving across every line with the cold concentration of a man used to finding weakness in everything. And the more he read, the thicker the unease inside him became, no longer vague as it had been on the night he stood by the window, but concrete, sharp, and shaped. The official testimony about that fateful night, the account the entire family had accepted as truth for 8 years, had all come from one single source, and that source was Aldrich Mercer. It was Aldrich who had reported that boss Salvio had died suddenly in his sleep from a heart attack. It was Aldrich who had presented evidence that the Holt family had embezzled and fled. And it was Aldrich who had arranged for Tobias to inherit power smoothly within only a few days afterward, so quickly that no one had time to ask a single question. Back then, Tobias had been too young, too wounded by the loss of the only adoptive father he had ever had, and too trusting of the advisor who had stood beside the family for many decades, so he had swallowed the whole story without the slightest trace of doubt. But now, with the cold gaze of a man who had lived long enough in a world built on lies, he began to see the cracks. He followed the recorded timeline in the files, compared the hours, and a gap slowly appeared, so clear he could not understand why he had failed to see it for 8 years. According to Aldrich's statement, boss Salvio had died before dawn, yet there was an important financial directive said to have been signed by Salvio himself, stamped with the time of that same afternoon, many hours after he was supposed to have been dead. A dead man could not sign documents, and that late signature could mean only one of 2 things. Either the time of death had been lied about, or the signature had been forged, and both possibilities led back to the same man. Tobias leaned back in his chair, his scarred fingers tightening into a fist on the desk, and a chill ran along his spine as he realized that the man he had trusted completely for 8 years, the man he had treated almost like an uncle, might very well be the one who had staged everything. But there was one more thing that troubled him more than all the rest, a memory he had tried to forget through all those years. In the final days of his life, Boss Salvio had hinted to him more than once about something, about how the family's power should not rest entirely in one person's hands, about a final wish he had written and kept somewhere safe, a document that clearly stated his true will for how the empire should be governed after he was gone. Tobias had never seen that final instruction. After Salvio's death, when he asked about it, Aldrich had brushed it aside in his usual smooth voice, saying the old man had only been rambling in his final days, that there had never been any final will, and that Salvio's wish had been to give everything to Tobias. Back then, he had believed it because he had wanted to believe it. But tonight, sitting amid the old files with that hole in the timeline staring him in the face, Tobias Vane suddenly wondered whether that final will truly did not exist, or whether it was still out there somewhere, and whether the throne he had occupied for 8 years had ever truly been his, or whether he was only another pawn on the board of a man far more intelligent than he had ever imagined. 2 days later, Tobias did something even he could not fully explain. He went to find Maggie again, but this time not to probe or interrogate her, but to take her to a place he had never brought anyone in 8 years. He waited for her in the alley after her shift ended, and instead of laying verbal traps, he only said that he needed her to look at something, that he believed she could see what he couldn't, and there was a raw honesty in his voice that Maggie had never heard before. She should have refused. She should have run. But there was something in his tired eyes that night that made her get into the car. He drove her to an old mansion on the edge of the city, a place now abandoned and covered in dust, and when they stepped into the vast study where a powerful man had once sat, Tobias said quietly that this was the very place where Boss Salvio Falcone had breathed his last 8 years ago. Maggie stood in the dust-covered room, and for the first time since meeting her old world again, she allowed that extraordinary memory of hers to move completely free. She walked slowly around the room, her eyes passing over every detail, and she began to speak, not through emotion, but through the numbers and time markers carved deep into her mind from 8 years before. She mentioned the financial directive, bearing Salvio's signature dated that very day, the document she herself had once processed through the family's system, and she recited the exact time it had been recorded, late in the afternoon, many hours after the time Aldrich had claimed the old man had been dead since before dawn. Tobias stood motionless and listened to her, and he realized that the gap in time he had needed many nights of burying himself in files to uncover had been carried in this girl's head for 8 years, accurate down to the minute. She knew nothing about the final will, but her numbers independently confirmed the very truth he had been tracing, that the official story of his adoptive father's death was a lie, and that the person who had built that lie was Aldrich Mercer. In that dark, dust-covered room, 2 people stood facing each other, and something no words could describe passed between them. Tobias looked at the small woman standing before him, the woman who had carried a terrible truth inside her for 8 years without being able to tell anyone, the woman who had buried her entire self in order to survive. And for the first time he understood that the loneliness in her eyes was as deep and cold as the loneliness he had carried with him all his life. He had lived 8 years in an empty penthouse no one dared come near, surrounded by the fear people had for him, but never once truly seen as the man beneath the ice. And now, standing in the room of the dead, he felt as if this girl were looking through all those outer layers to touch something even he had forgotten he once possessed. He stepped closer to her slowly and lifted his hand as if he were almost about to touch her cheek, and for one moment Maggie did not step back. She stood still, her eyes lifted to his, and those 2 lonely people stood there in silence, close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from him in the cold of the abandoned room. Close enough that one more moment would have brought every wall between them crashing down. But then fear came over Maggie like a wash of ice water, because she suddenly remembered who he was, remembered that the man standing before her, no matter how lonely he might be, was still the king of the very world that had killed her father and torn her family apart, still the man at the top of the empire that had stolen everything she loved. She couldn't let herself forget that. She couldn't let her heart betray itself. She stepped back once, then again, pulling every wall she had almost let fall back into place, and said in a soft but firm voice that she needed to go home. Tobias stopped with his hand still suspended in the air, and he did not try to hold her back. He only stood there watching her turn away, his palm still hovering where her cheek should have been. And in the moment she stepped out of the room of the dead, both of them understood that something had changed forever, and that neither of them could ever return to the person they had been before tonight. Aldrich Mercer had survived and ruled from the shadows for decades, not because of luck, but because of a terrifyingly sharp instinct, the kind of instinct that let him sense danger long before it took shape, and in these days, that instinct was screaming inside him. His niece had accidentally told him about the falcon coin in the hand of a server, and that detail alone was enough to rob him of sleep, because he knew exactly whom that coin had belonged to, knew there was only one person left in the world who might be carrying it. He had the server named Maggie quietly investigated, and when the photographs and information were brought back, when he saw the face, now grown into adulthood, but still carrying the familiar features of a 19-year-old girl he had believed had vanished forever 8 years earlier, the blood in his body seemed to freeze. Magdalene Holt was still alive. The shadow bookkeeper, the only person who carried in her mind the entire map of the money flow that could expose him, had returned to Chicago, and worse than that, he learned through his network of eyes and ears that she had begun making contact with Tobias Vane. Aldrich understood that if those two people ever came to truly trust each other, if Maggie's memory and Tobias's power were allowed to join together, then everything he had spent 8 years building and hiding would collapse into ash. And so, instead of striking directly in some crude, violent way, he chose the weapon he knew best, suspicion, because he understood that the surest way to destroy an alliance was to make both sides turn away from each other before it could even form. He began weaving a delicate web of lies aimed straight at Tobias's greatest weakness, the weakness Aldrich had watched and understood for years, his distrust of every human being down to the root. Aldrich arranged for false information to slowly leak to Tobias in ways that seemed accidental, through sources the man still trusted. A carefully forged document appeared, suggesting that the server named Maggie had actually been planted by a rival force of the family, that her approach to Tobias had not happened by chance, but according to a plan calculated long in advance. A few bribed witnesses whispered that she had once been seen meeting with people who worked for Vane's enemies. And most dangerous of all, Aldrich skillfully placed half a truth inside the lie. He let it be revealed that the girl truly carried the Holt name, the name of the traitors who had embezzled and fled years ago, and he allowed Tobias to draw his own conclusion, that the daughter of a traitor could only be a traitor herself, that perhaps she had come back not to seek justice, but to finish what her family had started, to drain the last secrets from the empire and disappear once more. Tobias received that information, while his mind was still in turmoil after the night in the dust-covered room, after the moment when he had almost touched her cheek, after the unfamiliar feeling that perhaps there was still someone in this world who could see the man beneath his ice. And precisely because he had almost allowed himself to believe, when suspicion was planted, it gnawed at him all the more violently. He sat alone in the darkness, turning over the forged documents Aldrich had so carefully laid before him, and the old monster of distrust rose again inside his chest, whispering that he had been a fool, that he had nearly let a strange girl deceive him, that every trace of honesty in her eyes might have been nothing but a perfect performance stage to bring him down. He remembered the question about 8 years that she had thrown at him before walking away, and now, through the warped lens Aldrich had placed before his eyes, that question no longer looked like a search for justice, but like a threat, a sign that she knew far too much about him in a dangerous way. The next time Maggie happened to cross paths with him at the restaurant, she immediately recognized the change, recognized that the ice had closed over again in his gray eyes, that the man who had nearly touched her in the room of the dead now looked at her as if he were looking at an enemy, and that a cold distance had been built between them for reasons she did not understand, not knowing that the man who had quietly raised that wall was sitting in the darkness, smiling, satisfied that he had divided the only alliance capable of destroying him before it had even been born. While the cold wall was being raised between her and Tobias, Maggie continued relentlessly following the thread Priya had given her, the small recurring payment so cleverly disguised that it had flowed quietly for 8 years to an unnamed address. The two women spent many nights tracing that money backward through each intermediary account, each layer of disguise, And at last, thanks to Maggie's extraordinary memory joined with Priya's forensics experience, they found its final destination, a secluded private care facility in the northern suburbs, a place so discreet it almost did not exist in any public record. When Maggie saw the name registered beneath that payment, a false name, but one carrying the exact initials her father had used to mark his private documents since she was a child, her heart seemed to stop. It was not a stream of money supporting a dead man. It was a stream of money imprisoning a man who was still alive, her father, Elias Holt, the man she had mourned and buried inside her heart for 8 long years, the man whose remains she had never been allowed to see, not even as a handful of ash, was still breathing, still being kept somewhere like a card locked inside a vault, kept alive not out of mercy, but because he was the only person who held the original ledger that could destroy Aldrich. Maggie collapsed over the table, her shoulders shaking, and for the first time in all those years, she let the tears pour out without restraint, tears mixed with unbearable pain, at realizing her father had spent 8 years in captivity, and with a blazing thread of hope, so fierce it almost hurt her, because after everything he was still there, and she still had a chance to find him. But Aldrich Mercer, with the sharp instinct that had saved his life countless times, also sensed that his secret money trail was being followed, and he understood that dividing Maggie from Tobias was not enough. He needed a chain to lock the girl in place. Through his network of eyes and ears, he had long known Maggie's greatest weakness, her 16-year-old sister with a sick heart, waiting for a surgery whose cost Maggie could barely even dream of paying, and Aldrich, without needing any crude act of violence, struck in exactly the subtle way he knew best. With his power and the hidden connections spread across the city, he quietly interfered with Pippa's surgery, causing the financial aid the hospital had just promised to suddenly be withdrawn without explanation, causing the operation that had already been scheduled to be pushed back indefinitely, turning the fate of that young fragile heart into something only one call from him could decide. It was a threat that did not need to be spoken aloud, an invisible hand tightening around the most precious thing Maggie had, and she understood the message the moment she received the news from the hospital, understood that her enemy had just shown her exactly how far he could reach. But that very cruel move accidentally planted the seed of Aldrich's downfall from a direction he had never expected. Bianca, by chance, overheard an exchange between her uncle and one of his men about interfering with the surgery of a 16-year-old girl, and stood frozen behind the half-open door. She was arrogant and cruel. She had once wanted to crush that server girl without mercy. But using the life of a sick child as a bargaining chip was a line even she had never imagined crossing. The vague unease that had once run along her spine in her uncle's study now hardened into clear terror, because for the first time, she truly saw the man beneath Aldrich Mercer's smooth smile, and she understood how merciless the man who had arranged her entire life, including her marriage, could truly be, and that perhaps she herself was only another piece on his board. A few days after tightening that invisible hand around Pippa's surgery, Aldrich Mercer decided to show himself, because he believed the girl now rested completely in his palm. A message from an unknown number told Maggie to come to a quiet, discreet cafe in River North in the middle of the afternoon, and when she stepped inside, she immediately recognized the salt and pepper-haired man sitting at the corner table, even though this was the first time in her life she had faced the man who had destroyed her family. Aldrich invited her to sit with a polite gesture, as if they were 2 old acquaintances, and he began speaking in the smooth voice that had deceived an entire empire for decades, saying he was very sorry things had gone this far, that he had always been fond of her father, and that he hoped they could reach an arrangement that benefited everyone. Maggie sat still, both hands resting on her thighs beneath the table, and in the pocket of her coat, a phone had silently been recording since before she entered the cafe. She let him speak, without interrupting, without reacting, using the very weapon of silence she had sharpened for 8 years, because she understood that an arrogant man who believed he held the upper hand would say far more on his own than any interrogation could ever drag out of him. And sure enough, the more Aldrich spoke, the more brazen he became, encouraged by the silence he mistook for submission. He laid the conditions directly on the table. He said he knew she carried the entire map of the money flow in her head, and that he needed her to surrender everything she knew along with a promise of permanent silence. disappear from Chicago once again, and never return in exchange. He coldly implied that her little sister's surgery would proceed smoothly, that the financial aid that had been withdrawn could return just as easily as it had vanished, and that the father she believed she had lost could continue to remain safe wherever he was. It was in that sentence, in the moment he confidently released that hint about her father to assert his power, that Aldrich made his fatal mistake, because he had just admitted, in his own voice, that Elias Holt was still alive and in his hands, and every word was now being preserved inside the phone in her pocket. Maggie lifted her eyes and looked straight into his, and with the expression of someone who had just been broken, she nodded faintly, saying in a small, trembling voice that she needed time to make arrangements, that she would surrender everything, as long as her sister was safe. She played the role of a prey that had surrendered so perfectly that Aldrich smiled with satisfaction, rose to button his coat, and walked away certain that he had won, never knowing that the quiet woman he had just left behind had made him dig his own grave with his own arrogance. When the cafe door closed behind Aldrich, Maggie sat motionless for a long while, letting the real trembling pass through her. Then she stopped the recording, and for the first time in many days, she knew what she had to do next. A recording alone would not be enough to bring down a man as powerful as Aldrich. She needed something she did not have. She needed power. She needed someone who could summon the entire family council and had enough weight to force them to listen, and there was only one person in the world who could do that. She knew there was now a cold wall between her and Tobias, one whose source she did not fully understand, knew he had gone back to looking at her as if she were an enemy, but she also understood that she had no choice left except to wager everything on him. That night she went to find him, and when she faced his gray eyes that had frozen over again, instead of trying to explain herself or beg, she silently placed the phone on the table and pressed play. Aldrich Mercer's smooth voice filled the still room, one confession after another, about the money trail, about the original ledger, about the father who was still alive and being held captive, and Tobias stood listening as the color slowly drained from his face, because every piece he had been searching for, through all those nights buried in old files, was now being confirmed by the traitor's own voice, and along with it, he painfully realized that every lie that had made him doubt her had come from the same hand that had deceived him for 8 years. When the recording ended and silence returned to cover the room, Tobias Vane stood motionless for a long while, and Maggie could see the war unfolding behind his gray eyes, the collapse of 8 years of lies, the cold fury aimed at the man who had manipulated him, and beneath all of that, something far harder for a man like him, regret. He lifted his eyes to her, and in a voice rougher and lower than usual, he admitted that he had doubted her, that he had allowed carefully planted lies to poison his mind, and that he had been wrong. For a man who had not said sorry to anyone in nearly a decade, the words came out awkward and heavy, but it was that very awkwardness that made them real. Maggie did not answer with blame. She only nodded faintly, because she understood better than anyone what it felt like to be betrayed by someone you trusted, and she knew this was not the time to feed old wounds when her father and her sister were both hanging by a fragile thread in Aldrich's hands. Those two people, both long accustomed to being alone, sat down across from each other at the table, and for the first time, instead of probing and defending themselves, they began to truly speak, fitting each piece of what they knew together, like two halves of a picture finally finding each other. Maggie laid out everything she and Priya had traced, the location of the secluded care facility where her father was being held, the secret money stream, the way Aldrich had interfered with Pippa's surgery. Tobias listened with the concentration of a commander used to calculating every move, and when she finished speaking, he began to draw out a plan, but halfway through, he stopped, and something inside him changed. For 8 years he had given countless orders, had arranged countless moves, but all of them had served his own power, the survival of the throne on which he sat. This was the first time he was planning something not for himself, not for the empire, but for an old man he had never met, and a 16-year-old girl waiting to have her heart repaired, for a woman who had lost everything to the very world he ruled. He realized it, and Maggie realized it too, through the way his voice softened, and something strangely warm slipped between them inside the cold room. They agreed that one strike had to be aimed at rescuing her father from the facility where he was being held, quietly and precisely, so Aldrich would have no time to order the destruction of his final card, while the other had to secure Pippa's safety and restore the girl's surgery. And finally, the decisive blow, they would summon a full meeting of the family council, where Tobias, as the head of the family, had enough authority to force everyone to attend, and there, before all the leaders, they would expose the truth with the recording and the original ledger, stripping Aldrich Mercer bare before the very empire he had secretly manipulated. As the plan gradually took shape, the night grew late, and both of them were worn down by the weight of what lay ahead, but it was within that weariness that the walls between them once again began to thin. Tobias looked at the woman sitting before him, the woman brave enough to walk into the tiger's den and record the confession of her enemy, the woman who had endured 8 years of silence without breaking. And he felt a deep respect he had never given anyone before. Maggie lifted her eyes and met his gaze, and this time, she did not rush to rebuild the walls, because she had seen in him something she had not expected, not the ruthless king of the underworld, but a lonely human being learning for the first time how to care about someone beyond himself. In that brief moment, amid the suffocating pressure of the danger waiting ahead, something fragile yet fierce flared to life between them, not through words, but through the way his hand lightly touched hers on the tabletop, and this time she did not pull away. But Aldrich Mercer had never been a man easily cornered, and the moment his network of eyes and ears sensed unusual movement, he understood that the girl had not submitted as he had believed, that the game had entered its final stage. In one cruel and calculated move, he quietly moved his 2 most valuable pieces to 2 different places, separating Maggie's father from the old holding site and taking Pippa out of the aunt's safe reach, hiding each of them at a separate secret location. Then, through a cold phone call, he told Maggie exactly where her father was being held, but dropped a malicious hint that there was someone else she loved who was also in his hands, somewhere she would never find in time. It was a trap woven from her own love, a brutal choice designed to break her, because he knew that no matter how many people she and Tobias had, they couldn't save someone when they did not know where that person was, and time was draining away minute by minute. Maggie stood in the middle of the room as panic rose up like a wave trying to drown her, because this time it was not about money or honor, but about the 2 lives she loved most in the world, the father she had only just found again after 8 years, and the little sister with a sick heart, and she only had information about one of them. But in that most desperate moment, the old self inside her, Magdalene Holt, the shadow bookkeeper with the sharpest mind an empire had ever possessed, rose back to the surface. She forced herself to stop panicking, sat down, and did the thing she did best in the world. She trusted the numbers. She understood that a man like Aldrich never acted outside his own system, that moving and holding a human being required money, required resources, and every dollar left a trace in the money map. She still carried perfectly intact inside her mind. She closed her eyes and traced backward through every account, every unusual expense in recent days that Priya had helped her update, searching for a second link running parallel to the care facility where her father had once been held, a twin stream of money that had just been activated. And then she found it, a small new payment made to an empty property Aldrich controlled through a shell company, a place only someone who held his entire financial structure in her mind could recognize, a place fists and guns would never find, but a mind could. She opened her eyes and read the address aloud, and Tobias, standing beside her, looked at her with astonishment mixed with respect, because he had just witnessed the true weapon of this woman, not violence but intelligence, the weapon they had tried to destroy 8 years ago, but had never been able to take from her. Now that they knew both locations, Tobias immediately coordinated 2 rescue teams to move at the same time, so Aldrich would not have time to order either piece destroyed when one side was compromised. He personally led a small group of his most trusted and elite men to the place where Elias was being held, while sending his remaining absolutely loyal right hand to coordinate the second team toward Pippa. The 2 rescues calculated down to the minute and synchronized through brief, precise calls. Maggie sat at the command center, the bridge between the 2 attacks, her hands gripping the Falcon coin tightly, listening for every signal that came in through the pounding of her heart inside her chest. And in those minutes that stretched like eternity, she understood that the fate of the 2 people she loved most did not depend on the strength of the men carrying guns, but on the mind her father had trained in her since childhood, on the belief that numbers never knew how to lie. The two rescue teams succeeded almost at the same time, and when the reports came through the line that both Elias and Pippa were safe, Maggie collapsed into the chair, her whole body trembling with relief, her hand still gripping the falcon coin so tightly that its sharp edge left an imprint in her skin. But she knew the war was not over, because rescuing the two hostages only meant taking back what Aldrich had stolen. To make sure he could never reach for her family again, she had to destroy him at the very heart of his own power. And so Tobias summoned a full meeting of the family council, using the full weight of his position as head of the family to force every leader to appear in the solemn meeting room at the family mansion, including Aldrich Mercer, who walked in with his usual smooth smile, completely unaware that he was stepping into his own trial. Once everyone had settled around the long table, the door opened and Maggie walked in. No longer the server in the worn old apron, she moved through that room full of powerful men with a calm that silenced everyone there, and she placed the silver coin engraved with the falcon onto the table before them all. The sound of metal touching wood was soft, but it rolled through the room like thunder, because every seasoned leader there recognized that sacred symbol, and they understood that the only person who could carry it was someone of the bloodline of the family boss, Salvio, had once trusted completely. Maggie introduced herself by the true name she had buried for 8 years, Magdalene Holt, daughter of Elias Holt, and a wave of shock spread through the room. Then Priya Wexford stepped in behind her and laid the forensic files on the table, the detailed money trail analyses, proving that the Holt family had never stolen a single dollar, that Aldrich himself was the one who had drained the empire and blamed the innocent. And when doubt still remained on the faces of some of the leaders, Maggie placed the phone on the table and pressed play, letting Aldrich's own smooth voice fill the room. Confession after confession about the money flow, about the original ledger, about the father who had been held captive for 8 years. Aldrich's face paled little by little as his own voice accused him before the entire empire. But the decisive blow had not yet fallen. Tobias stepped forward, and this time he held something in his own hand, a second silver coin engraved with the same falcon as Maggie's, along with an envelope yellowed by the years. He said that thanks to the information Maggie had provided, and thanks to Elias' testimony after being rescued, he had found the place where his adoptive father had hidden his true final will, and that boss Salvio had minted 2 coins, not one given to the Holt family, and one kept with the will for the person he truly trusted to help preserve the empire in the right way. Tobias opened the envelope and read Boss Salvio's final will aloud before the entire council, a document clearly stating that the family's power was never to be placed entirely in one person's hands, but had to be governed under the oversight of the keeper of the ledger, the Holt family, so that no single individual could manipulate the whole empire. The entire room fell deathly silent, because now everyone understood the terrible truth, that for 8 years the throne Tobias Vane had occupied had been built on a lie created by Aldrich himself, that the advisor had buried the will, blamed the Holt family, and pushed a young Tobias, broken by grief, onto the throne like a puppet he could control from the shadows. Knowing he had been cornered with no way out, Aldrich's smooth mask finally fell away, revealing the truly ruthless man beneath it, and he sprang up in desperation, throwing the entire room instantly into chaos. In desperation, Aldrich Mercer grabbed at the last frantic effort of a man accustomed to pulling strings from the shadows. He tried to call upon a few leaders he had once favored, tried to sow doubt by claiming all this evidence was only a scheme by Tobias to seize even more power. But his voice now sounded unsteady and hollow, because no one in the room believed him anymore. The men he had once manipulated now looked at him, with the eyes of people who had just realized they had been deceived for years. And when he tried to rush toward the door, it was the family's own loyal guards, following Tobias's cold command, who blocked him and restrained him without spilling a single drop of blood. Aldrich was forced down into the chair, where he had once sat like a powerful man, his face twisted with hatred and fear. And for the first time in decades, the man who had always controlled everything from the darkness had completely lost control. But Tobias did not choose to settle everything by the brutal laws of the underworld, as his old self surely would have done, because standing there, with the truth finally exposed and Maggie beside him, he understood that ending Aldrich in silence would only make him another link in the endless chain of violence that had swallowed his entire life. Instead, he chose a road that he would never have imagined taking 8 years earlier. Priya Wexford, with the full set of meticulous financial records that she and Maggie had worked so hard to piece together, had already prepared a complete body of evidence on Aldrich's long list of crimes. And that evidence was delivered to federal agents who had quietly been watching the Empire's murky financial operations for a long time, but had never had enough proof to act. Aldrich Mercer was handed over to the FBI, along with a file so complete that no brilliant lawyer could pull him free. And the man who had controlled an entire empire from the shadows for decades was finally led away beneath daylight, not by an underworld bullet, but by the very legal system he had always believed he stood above. That surrender did not come without a price for Tobias, because in order to provide evidence against Aldrich, he was forced to cooperate with the agents under conditions, accepting strict oversight of himself and his empire, a trade he chose with clear eyes, because he had decided it was time to bring the family out of the darkness, one step at a time, no matter how long and difficult that road might be. Amid the collapse of her uncle, Bianca Castile stood silently in a corner of the room, and the moral line she had accidentally touched when she overheard the conversation about a 16-year-old girl's surgery now became a firm decision. She stepped before the council, and in a voice that for the first time held no arrogance at all, she voluntarily revealed everything she knew about Aldrich's schemes, confirming that he had arranged her marriage as a piece to strengthen his power, and that she had witnessed his cruelty with her own eyes. Her testimony was the final piece that sealed the coffin over her uncle's fate, and although it could not erase the cruelty she herself had shown Maggie on that fateful night at the restaurant, it also showed that even the most arrogant person could choose to turn back when standing before a line that must not be crossed. Bianca lost everything: her status, the marriage she had once seen as the peak of her destiny, her position in the world where she had once ruled, and she left that room in humiliation, but also with a measure of mercy because she had turned back in time, allowed to quietly leave the city and begin again from nothing instead of facing something far worse. And then, before the entire family council, the honor of the Holt family was finally restored after 8 years of slander. The name of Elias Holt, the loyal man who had endured captivity for 8 years instead of betraying the trust placed in him, was cleared before all those who had once believed he was a traitor. And with it, the dark shadow that had weighed on Maggie's life for all those years was finally lifted, returning to her not only the truth, but also the name and dignity people had tried to steal from her hands. 6 weeks after the fateful night at the family mansion, in one of the brightest and warmest hospitals in Chicago, Pippa Holt was taken into the operating room to repair the young heart that had tormented her through all of her childhood. The surgery lasted many hours, and Maggie sat waiting in the hallway with her hands clenched around the falcon coin. But this time she was not alone, because beside her was a quiet man who had silently paid the full cost of that operation without ever wanting her to know. The man who had arranged for the best surgeons in the city to hold the scalpel. The man who simply took her trembling hand and said softly that everything would be all right. When the doctor came out with a tired but radiant smile and told them the surgery had succeeded, that the girl's heart would now beat strongly, Maggie broke down crying, and this time they were tears of a happiness she hadn't dared dream of for 8 years. But the moment that made her heart overflow most was when she turned and looked at the man sitting in a wheelchair at the end of the hallway, thinner and far more silver-haired than in her memory, but still with those gentle eyes, still the father who had taught her that numbers never knew how to lie. Elias Holt opened his arms wide, and Maggie ran to him and collapsed against his chest. Father and daughter held each other tightly after 8 years torn apart by lies and darkness, and in that embrace lived all the years of suffering that were finally beginning to heal. The months that followed passed like a slow but steady mending. Tobias Vane kept his promise, step by step bringing the empire out of the shadows, turning dark operations into legal and transparent businesses, enduring oversight and paying the price for the wrongs of the past, with a determination even he had not known he possessed, because he had found a reason to become a better man than the one he used to be. Maggie, with the sharp financial mind an entire empire had once desired, opened a small financial consulting office in Bronzeville, a place where she used the very gift that had once been exploited by darkness to help ordinary working people manage their honest wages. And on her desk, inside a simple glass frame, lay the silver coin engraved with the falcon, no longer the symbol of an underworld empire, but a reminder that underestimating a quiet and steadfast woman could be the most costly mistake anyone would ever make. And then, on one peaceful evening, as the two of them sat together watching the city lights come on, Tobias finally told her something he had kept hidden, that 8 years earlier, on the night she fled their world, he had still been a young soldier, when he happened to see a girl carrying a child as she ran through the darkness near the docks. And although he should have stopped her, something inside him had made him turn his face away and let her pass, a rare act of humanity he had buried and forgotten for all those years. He had never seen her face clearly in that darkness, but that moment had stayed with him, and when he saw the falcon fall onto the marble floor, something deep in his soul had recognized her before his reason had time to understand. It turned out their fates had crossed 8 years before, through one small act of kindness in the dark, and now it had brought those two lonely people back to each other. Maggie and Tobias's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's dignity is never measured by the clothes they wear or the work they do, that kindness, no matter how small, can echo through many years, and that true strength doesn't live in shouting or power, but in patience, integrity, and a heart that refuses to bow before evil. Sincere love can soften even a soul that seemed to have turned to stone, and the truth, no matter how long it has been buried, will always find its way back into the light. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can listen to more moving and meaningful stories together every day. How do you feel about Maggie's story? About her journey from darkness back into the light, and about the power of sincere love to transform a person? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear what you want to say. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and calm every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.